Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So today we're not going to be working in this particular sketchbook today, as the kind people at Arrtx actually have sent me a few more items to try, which included this hardcover A5 sketchbook alongside with these wide tip opaque acrylic markers. So let's go ahead and take a closer look before we actually start to use them for today's video. So let's take a look at this sketchbook first. It has this really cute kind of moss greenish kind of cover. It's kind of on the warmer side, but even though it has this kind of texture and embossing on it, it is a hardcover sketchbook. The size of it is A5, which is about 8.5 by 6.1 inches. On the inside, you can see there's a little bit of kind of like information regarding the sketchbook itself. Not sure why the left side has cut off text, but basically this exposed binding allows it to lay completely flat. So you can see here is the exposed edge, but I'll show you guys what it looks like when it's laid completely flat. It's kind of nice that it lays flat like this because the paper is actually quite thick. It is 180 GSM and there's about 60 sheets of paper in here, which will equal about 120 pages that you can use to work. And I believe both sides are the same texture, which is kind of nice. On the front side, there is also a little pocket rather than the back side, which I think is kind of neat and kind of smart design just because of the binding. I'll talk a little bit more about the paper itself a little bit later, but let's take a look at the acrylic markers. So Arrtx actually sent me quite a few acrylic markers from like the last few weeks, but these ones are a little bit different. There are less colors. So this comes in a pack of 10 and it has a 15mm tip size. So these are actually activated in a very similar way to other acrylic paint markers. So you would actually shake the marker first, then after that you would press down on the nib to allow the kind of acrylic paint to kind of seep from the barrel all the way down to the nib. The purple one actually dispensed quite a bit of ink compared to the other ones. The other ones actually had the paint flow a little bit more slowly, but either way you can see that it has quite good coverage. You can actually have a little bit of varied lines and a little bit of versatility with the tip, so you can go a little bit wider, a little bit sharper, or kind of go for a middle of the road kind of size for the tip size. So I'm showing you guys a little bit of the other ones being activated right here, and you can see that the paint kind of just slowly seeps into the actual part of the nib, which didn't take too long to activate, so we can go ahead and quickly do our little paint swatches. So from the other videos, I actually have all the paint swatches kind of section together, as I am going to be using those markers in conjunction with these kind of like wide tipped markers. I'll show you guys a little bit of a close-up of what it looks like when they are wet and as well as when they dry, because sometimes there is a little bit of a discrepancy in terms of the color, but for the most part they dry pretty much the same as they were wet, so I don't feel like there's too much of a discrepancy. So let's move on to the actual drawing or painting for today's video. So I do find this kind of size a little bit intimidating to use. So for today's session, and maybe in the future I can be a little bit more ambitious with how I use these kinds of markers, I'm going to be using them mostly for blocking in kind of like a background color for today's drawing. So once we get into the time-lapse portion, I'll talk a little bit more about the paper, but for now, the kind of first initial pass that I did for the markers, you can kind of see here, it's a little bit streaky, but for the most part quite opaque. I feel like if you really wanted to have like a very solid application, you can probably just do another layer and get it pretty flat. So I found it a little bit hard to draw on the paint surface, so I'm using just a normal kind of mechanical pencil to quickly sketch out a headshot of Zhongli from Genshin Impact. So because I was a little bit intimidated to use the actual wide tip markers for the entirety of the kind of drawing today, I switched over to the Simp Tap markers, which I talked about in last week's video, alongside with some of their other acrylic markers that have brush tips, just because I have a little bit more control and a little bit of a bigger selection, I guess, of colors for me to work with. So in terms of the paper type, so for the sketchbook itself, I believe this paper type would be more considered like thicker mixed media paper. It does have a little bit of tooth to it, but overall very, very smooth. It is also a very thick paper, about 180 GSM, which is pretty thick and pretty sturdy. I'll put up some photos of some of the tests that I did. I did do a watercolor test, which you guys can see here, so you can kind of see a little bit of the texture alongside how the paint reacts with the paper. So I'm showing you both kind of like the finished and the initial wash of the watercolor paint, because I feel like it's a little bit interesting on how the watercolor lays on the paper and how it dries. So you can definitely use it to your advantage, or you can kind of use it however you want, depending on if you want smooth application or you don't mind that it kind of dries in a particular way. But for the most part, it dries pretty well. I did not have too much buckling, though usually whenever I paint or do anything that has a little bit of wet media, I do use binder clips to kind of clamp down my paper so that it prevents more buckling, and when the paper dries, it kind of dries flat. So buckling, not too bad. If anything, because the paper is so thick, the buckling was not very noticeable. I did think that the kind of watercolor does sit on top of the paper a little bit more than, let's say, watercolor paper, so it doesn't get absorbed as quickly, which, like I said, you can kind of use that to your advantage. I also am quite fond of the texture and the application of the watercolor on this paper, so I actually probably will use watercolor more often, and I do think maybe I am going to use this sketchbook as my next sketchbook once I finish my current one, just because I did do a little bit of drawing in here and I quite like the paper. Graphite, I did a very quick test. I drew my OC holding a drink, and I noticed because there is a little bit of tooth to the paper, I think graphite and pencil crayons would actually react nicely to the paper, and I feel like you can get a very smooth application. But because the paper is fairly smooth, or at least like the texture is quite like uniformed and not as like abrasive, if you prefer smoother paper for graphite, I think this would actually work quite well. I think the graphite shows up quite dark and very easily on the paper, which is kind of nice, as well as other mediums. So the other ones I did kind of like more quick swatches. I did use a colored pencil just to see the texture a little bit more in the paper, but the other ones I used were also a ballpoint pen, which kind of took nicely to the paper as well, alongside with alcohol markers and water-based markers. So for the alcohol markers, there was a little bit of bleed through. I do think you also require just a little bit more effort to blend the markers completely, but because the paper is quite thick, I think if you do like maybe a pass or two, you probably could get away with minimal bleeding. But if you do heavy blending, this paper does bleed at the very end anyways. So I'll show you guys kind of like pictures of both of those if you're interested. Water-based markers kind of applied really nicely. I definitely still noticed some streaking, but it's a lot less noticeable compared to, let's say, notebook paper. And I think that's it for the testing. So I do think if you're looking for an affordable mixed media sketchbook, take a look at the Arrtx one. I think the paper is quite lovely. I do like the fact that it lays completely flat, and the hardcover, which is definitely great to kind of protect your sketchbook. The pockets are quite a nice touch as well. So yeah, if you're definitely looking for more of an affordable kind of mixed media sketchbook, definitely check them out. I think a lot of people would kind of enjoy this type of paper anyways. So in the future, I can definitely see myself using it as like maybe my next sketchbook once I finish my current one. So on to the drawing again. So as I'm kind of like painting and zhongli with the markers, I did like the color selection that I chose for this one, as I was playing around with the yellows, the blues, and the browns. But you know me, I definitely like adding line work at the very end, even though I feel like I could have got away with doing probably the rest of Zhongli's face with the brown to kind of give it more of a softer and kind of more I don't know how to explain it, more of like paper cutout look to it, because it's all flat and very solid. But I really like adding line art, and because the Simp Tap markers does have a nice brush tip, I was kind of, you know, playing around with the inking for this, is what I will call it, I guess. So for the line work, I decided to just use straight up black, and I feel like it kind of lends itself to more of a graphic style in terms of what it kind of looks like because of the bolder lines. I'll apologize in advance, but I feel like my brain has a hard time thinking on how to use these markers in a way that I would like to use them, just because I am a little bit still hesitant in terms of like layering up colors a lot or like blending and mixing them. So a lot of the stuff that I like to do with kind of like acrylic markers, because they're so opaque and usually brightly colored, is that I tend to lean towards something a little bit more bold and kind of more graphic rather than something more soft and blended. But I kind of approach the second one a little bit more differently, but the end result looks very similar just because I do fall back and go with doing some kind of line art to tie everything together, which I don't think looks too bad, but I think it would have looked interesting if I left it without the line work. So as I'm kind of finishing up Zhongli here, I've been kind of thinking if I want to go back and paint with acrylic paints again, just because I think it'll be more of a fun experience to maybe revisit another painting kind of with brushes and stuff, even though these paint markers are very fun to use and very convenient, if anything. So the second drawing that I'm doing for today is of Nouvellette, and similar process in terms of where I started. I decided to take the blue paint marker from the wider set and kind of block out a more of a rectangular shape once again to kind of give it some kind of background for me to work on. I went ahead and sketched off screen this time just because I was having a hard time thinking on what I wanted it to look like, and I decided to go with Nouvellette, one because might as well draw the dragons from Genshin Impact, but also the fact that I really wanted to do something with blue, and Nouvellette actually has quite a bit of blue in his outfit, but not exactly near his face, so I wanted to try something different and keep everything more or less monochromatic and kind of almost chunk it in a very silhouetted way. I don't know if this makes sense, but the way how I have it kind of set up, I feel like it could have worked without the line work. You'll probably see it a little bit later, but I was trying my best to kind of pull more of the highlights with a lighter blue alongside with the white. But even though Nouvellette's hair is completely white with some light blue locks in there, I did not want to paint the entire thing white just because I feel like it would have been too jarring with the fact that his skin would be more of a darker to mid-tone blue with like less kind of like highlights in his face and stuff, and his face would be too contrasted with his hair. So I did my best to kind of leave certain chunks of his hair still kind of like solid blue, but then as I'm kind of transitioning the lighting a little bit, I'm using the lighter blue and then I'm moving and shifting back to the white to kind of still kind of frame his face a little bit so his face doesn't get lost from the background, and hopefully it kind of works out. But like I said, I'm gonna fall back and start doing some line art afterwards because that's just what I'm usually used to and I thought it would look better. But at this point, I think I liked it without the line art and kind of more of a subtle kind of monochromatic look. But you guys can let me know if you think the line art helped it or it kind of didn't help it. I'm on the boat that I feel like it didn't really help it. I think it's also due to the fact that my line art was not really delicate in terms of how I did some of the lines. It was kind of thick, a little bit wobbly. I didn't really add in a lot of like details, so a lot of the stuff just looks very flat and chunky rather than anything very flowy or giving it more dimension by using the line art, if that makes sense. I just feel like it didn't really add anything that was not already added via the other values of the blues that I was using. So yeah, just something for the future for me to think about, that sometimes less is more. But also let me know if you guys want me to do another acrylic painting video. I think the last time I did it might have been in 2020? No, 2022 I meant, which is the Tignari piece where I painted on a linen panel board, and I did that with acrylic paints, and I think that was like the first time painting in 5 years or ish, around there, because I think I haven't painted since graduation from uni, and even that, I did not really paint in my last year with acrylics. I painted with watercolors, if anything, for my third and fourth year, I believe. So yeah, it'd be fun to revisit acrylic paints, I think, just because it is a medium that I feel very, I was gonna say uncomfortable, but it's not even uncomfortable. It's just the fact that I don't prefer the medium because I don't practice using it a lot. But, you know, I'll talk about that maybe in another video if I end up doing acrylic painting again. But I hope you guys enjoyed today's video as we take a closer look at the two little kind of marker paintings that I did for today's session. And yeah, if you guys would like to check out any of the products that I've used in today's video, such as the markers or the sketchbook, feel free to look in the description as I'll have links to the products and any codes if possible. So thank you again for watching today's video, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!